August 8, 1942, 0140. Iron Bottom Sound, off Savo Island, Solomon Islands. Salt stung the lips of the men on watch. The moon was a thin coin behind a cloud. The sea, a black sheet rippled by a warm trade wind. From the bridge of the heavy cruiser USS Quincy, men in oilskins peered into the dark with binoculars that returned little but the faint, oil-slick sheen of water. A radio operator hunched over a set of valves and carbon buttons that crackled like distant insects. Down in Turret 2, Chief Petty Officer Daniel Dan Morales, broad shoulders, a $50 scar on his left cheek from a coal handling accident, listened for the clunk of a shell train and tapped a cigarette against the metal butt of a 5-inch round. On the forecastle, young seaman Jack Hargrove squinted at the horizon and swore he heard motors, though the chart said only empty ocean and the faint hum of their own engines. 2 nights before, American and Australian meetings had been filled with brittle jokes. Japanese torpedoes, one lieutenant had scoffed over coffee. They run on rice and prayer. In naval bars from Pearl Harbor to Brisbane, the story went that Japanese torpedoes were short-ranged, erratic, and would scream to the surface like startled birds when they ran out of fuel. Men who had never seen them in action traded those jokes because it made them feel safer, funny, human, and small beneath the sudden, immense machinery of war. Tonight, though, jokes were brittle and quiet, as the men checked depth gauges and listened for a sound that might never come. From the darkness north of Savo Island came the barely noticeable purr of screws. A different language of engines, sharper, more precise, the sound of destroyers creeping on a mission they had rehearsed in maps and midnight briefings. The Japanese destroyer line, sleek, low in the water, cut through the night led by the flagship, her captain moving like a shadow on the bridge. Above them, Rear Admiral Gunichi Mikawa watched the instruments with the surgeon's patience of an officer who had planned for long shots. Those destroyers carried a secret in their racks. Torpedoes longer than any the Allies expected, fueled not with compressed air but with pure oxygen. The men who maintained them had learned to treat each cylinder and valve with the respect of a priest. A single spark, small, careless, could have turned their ship into a torch. On Quincy's bridge, Lieutenant Commander Mark Avery, squat, jaw clenched, his voice hoarse from a steady week of command, shifted his binoculars. He could see finally the dark silhouettes of cruisers and destroyers moored near Savo. He could not see the machines that would make the difference. The American cruisers were confident. Their radars, primitive, new, flickering, had not picked up a coherent surface formation. The men compared notes, lit cigarettes in the lee of steel, and the lighter mood returned for a moment. Short-range muscle, someone muttered, and a laugh went around like a half-hearted buoy. At Or 152, the ocean answered with a silence that swallowed laughter. It was not the abrupt, violent sound of shellfire. It was the stranger, more patient sound of the sea being disturbed in a way that no one near Quincy recognized at first. No muffled boom, just a shadowy shudder that moved through the hull like the sniff of a predator. Then a pale, phosphorescent streak traced the water. A torpedo wake, impossibly thin and long, heading straight for the American line. To a bow lookout like Hargrove, it looked like a pale silver thread, more like a needle sewn through the dark than the usual blunt wake they expected. For a moment, officers argued over range. Perhaps 40,000 yards? No, impossible. The American doctrine, drilled into men from Annapolis to the Pacific Fleet's briefing rooms, assumed torpedo arcs and engine burns limited threats to a few thousand yards. The Japanese weapon before them did not obey those assumptions. It came with a ghostly absence, no bubble trail churning at the surface, no foaming, no easy clue. It moved with a smooth, soft whisper. On Quincy's plotting table, a junior officer slapped a grease pencil across a chart where the line should have stopped and said, not quite sure if he meant it, That's farther than a Japanese torpedo should go. The first impact was not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. A dark, quiet explosion, an internal concussion, shuddered through the hull of the USS Vincennes, anchored awkwardly to make a defensive line. The light on Vincennes' bow lantern went out in a scatter of sparks. Men spilled from compartments, some thrown like rag dolls. A stackman screamed and was cut off by the roar of water. In the smoky confusion, a petty officer shouted a single word into a telephone. Torpedo. Aboard a Japanese destroyer, a slender corporal named Saito, adjusted the oxygen valves with the trembling fingers of a man who had been told the physics and chemistry of his weapon in classroom lectures, and had then been bound to secrecy. He had watched the torpedo rack slide out and felt the cool metallic smell of oxygen, cold as the inside of a winter chest. He could not see the explosion. He only heard it as a far distant sound, and felt the satisfaction known to men who see plans work. His captain whispered a curt order into the dark, and the destroyer slipped away, leaving a surface skittering with men and light and the copper smell of burnt metal. Back on the American cruisers, the reaction mutated quickly from confusion to disbelief to a cold sort of respect. "They can hit us from that range?" someone whispered. The phrase carried the weight of a strategy undone. Bouquets of flares unfolded like dying flowers over the water. Searchlights threw wide cones of pale light that revealed the torn shapes of ships and the stunned faces of sailors. On console and chart table alike, officers redrew the boundaries of what they thought possible. Men who had joked about rice-powered torpedoes found the humor curdling in their throats. The nickname the Allies would later give the weapon, Long Lance, was an attempt at containment. To name the thing, to make it explainable. But tonight, in the wet and the dark, it felt like an arrow that had changed the rules of the fight. Somewhere in the melee, the sound of a speaking trumpet cut through orders. "Damage control. Party stations." Men trained for such moments moved like automata. Hose teams hauling lines, electricians stripping charred wiring, surgeons tearing open uniforms to find shrapnel. A petty officer with a cracked voice barked the words sailors rely on when metal fails. "Save the ship. Save the ship." The ship, though, had already recorded the fact of being outranged. The calculus of risk, the comfortable maps and doctrine, had a new entry. Oxygen, range. The quiet wake of a torpedo that came from farther and truer than anyone aboard had dared imagine. In the cold dawn that would come hours later, historians, officers, and exhausted sailors would name the torpedo, trace its technical differences, and argue about culpability and intelligence failures. But in these first moments, on deck slick with seawater and oil, with men coughing and eyes wide with shock, the story was simply of a new killer at sea, a weapon that had just rewritten the very geometry of naval night fighting. Men who had mocked Japanese torpedoes 2 nights before found that mockery stripped away like paint in the ocean. August 8, 1942, 02:07, Iron Bottom Sound. The sea boiled in pockets of flame and steam around the staggering American cruisers. Shells screamed overhead. Tracers stitched crooked red lines through black sky, and the once steady American battle line dissolved into confusion. On USS Quincy, the world had turned into a shuddering kaleidoscope of noise and motion. Alarms wailed, 2 short bursts, 1 long, and the deck pitched hard to port as if the sea had suddenly lifted a corner of the ship. Men scrambled, slipping on wet steel slicked with seawater and oil. Lieutenant Commander Avery grabbed a stanchion to keep his footing. He shouted over the roar of guns, "Track target bearing 315. But the fire control director hesitated. Their radar, cutting edge by American definition, primitive by later standards, couldn't parse the chaos of overlapping silhouettes and islands. The Japanese formation was fast, precise. Quincy's main battery finally thundered. The recoil slammed through the hull. Below deck, Dan Morales pushed a shell into the hoist with his shoulder, gritting his teeth. The entire turret smelled of hot oil and metal. A messenger dashed past the hatch and yelled something about flooding in compartments forward of the mess deck. Dan barely heard him over the roar of machinery and the metallic hammering of the shell hoist. In the cramped turret space, men sweated and swore, each motion practiced into muscle memory. Meanwhile, several miles away, far beyond the distance American doctrine considered torpedo effective, the Japanese destroyer Fubuki was already slipping into a turn, engines humming like a content predator. In the dim glow of red lamps, Petty Officer Saito watched the torpedo racks retract. The launch crew exhaled. The most dangerous moment was over. Pure oxygen was a demon, unpredictable, volatile. They treated it with reverence, and this was no ordinary torpedo. Years earlier, 1931, Kure Naval Arsenal, Japan. Rear Admiral Shigeru Tanaka stood with his hands clasped behind his back, examining something that looked like a polished steel spear resting on padded wooden supports. Engineers hovered nearby, sleeves rolled up, the smell of solvent and machining coolant clinging to their clothes. One of them, Chief Engineer Kiyoshi Hattori wiped sweat from his brow. It is dangerous, Hattori warned Tanaka. We use pure oxygen instead of compressed air. If a valve sticks, Tanaka interrupted gently. A weapon that cannot be dangerous to us cannot be dangerous to the enemy. Hattori tapped a small brass injector plate. Pure oxygen means no nitrogen bubble trail, no wake. They will not see it coming. Tanaka nodded once. Later, inside a classroom at Yokosuka Naval Base, young torpedo officers sat at desks while an instructor chalked formulas of fuel mix ratios and oxygen pressures across a blackboard. The windows were shut and a guard posted inside. Secrecy smothered every word spoken. The officer at the front tapped the diagram of the Type 93 and spoke with absolute certainty. This will make night our ally. Range over 40 kilometers. Explosive charge more than double that of the American Mark 15. An ensign raised his hand. Sir, you at that range, won't it be inaccurate? The instructor smiled thinly. That is why Japan trains harder. We will fire not at where the enemy is. He traced a straight line across the board, but where he will be. The class murmured, and they will never see the wake. Back at Iron Bottom Sound, 1942. On Quincy, Avery tried to make sense of what was happening. Recheck bearing on target destroyers. He barked. A cryptic reply crackled back. Sir, hard to track. They are fast. Destroyers don't close to torpedo range this quick, Avery snapped. They shouldn't be able to, a lookout interrupted. Another wake. Starboard side. No one wanted to believe it. A torpedo wake at that angle meant the Japanese destroyers had launched from impossible range. Dan in Turret 2 suddenly felt Quincy jump. A violent crunching explosion ripped across the hull, the deck lurching as if the ocean had punched the ship square in the gut. Dan was thrown backward, the world going sideways. The lights cut out. Emergency red lamps flickered in their place. Flooding. Forward bulkhead! Shut the hatch! Shut it! Men slammed the watertight door, sealing screaming sailors on the other side. Dan stumbled to his feet, horror and instinct competing in his chest. On the Japanese destroyer line, Saito listened calmly to range reports. Impact confirmed. 2 hits. Cruiser burning. Enemy still unaware of our full formation. Their squadron commander spoke quietly, but every word held steel. Prepare second salvo. Saito opened the valve wheel on the next torpedo. He inhaled the icy metallic smell of oxygen. He felt no triumph, only inevitability. On Quincy, Avery braced his hand on a chart table slick with spilled coffee and seawater. Searchlights stabbed out across the black water, illuminating columns of smoke pouring from American cruisers. Jesus, whispered Hargrove from the bow. They're killing us in the dark. Every American training manual said torpedoes had limited reach. Every intel briefing underestimated Japanese oxygen technology. Every joke, every laugh felt like a ghost now. Avery rasped, "Send to Fleet Command, the Japanese have a long-range torpedo." But the radio room was half-flooded. No message would reach command in time, and in the darkness more wakes glided toward them, silent, invisible, unavoidable. August 8, 1942, 02:13, Iron Bottom Sound. The second torpedo hit Quincy amidships. It didn't sound like an explosion. It sounded like the world being torn in half. A deep concussive whump that blew open compartments and turned steel bulkheads into razor-edged confetti. A geyser of black water sprayed 40 feet into the air, backlit by burning aviation fuel pouring from the hangar deck. The ship stopped breathing for half a heartbeat. Then all hell woke up. Men went tumbling across the deck, some slamming against rails, some into each other. A fireball roared upward from the portside catapult where Quincy's scout seaplane had been stored. The flames caught the aviation fuel spreading across the deck and erupted in a swirling orange firestorm. Seaman Jack Hargrove crawled along the scorched deck, coughing, his eyebrows singed away. He grabbed the railing and forced himself upright, vision swimming. He could taste burning paint, hot oil, and cordite. His ears rang so violently the world became silent, like someone had thrown a thick blanket over the chaos. All he could feel was the heat. Behind him, a voice, raw, panicked, cut through the ringing. "Man overboard." "Starboard side!" Jack turned just in time to see a sailor scramble for a life ring, hands shaking. And then, the distant, impossibly calm blast of another Japanese firing order. Japanese destroyer Amagiri. Same moment, the signal officer dropped his flag. Torpedo Officer Saito counted the seconds mentally. 1, 2, 3, 4. Release. The next oxygen-fueled Type 93 slid into the water with a deliberate, deadly grace, almost silent. No hissing of compressed air, no telltale stream of bubbles, just a faint wake, quickly swallowed by the night. Range 15,000 yards. The Americans still hadn't turned hard enough or fast enough, Saito whispered, nearly reverent. Long reach. Sure strike. Beside him, Lieutenant Shoji glanced through binoculars at the American cruisers, now outlined by their own burning wreckage. Every man in every navy believes in his doctrine, Shoji murmured. Tonight theirs dies. USS Quincy, O2, 15 inside turret 2. Dan Morales slammed his shoulder against a jammed shell hoist while sparks rained down from severed power conduits overhead. The pneumatic lines feeding shell rotation had ruptured. The autoloader was dead. Men wrestled shells manually, each one 95 pounds of steel and explosive. Ready. Ram, Dan barked through clenched teeth. With a metallic shriek, the shell finally slid into the breach. Fire! The gun recoiled like a bull kicking backward. The blast blew hot air across their faces, momentarily overpowering the smoke that swirled in the turret. Someone cheered. For a heartbeat, they were warriors again, not just targets in a floating coffin. Then a call came from the intercom. Thin, distorted, terrified. Bridge to turret 2, Captain dead. Exec has the con. Dan's blood ran cold. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Avery clutched a railing slick with fuel and blood. Captain Samuel Moore lay crumpled near the starboard wing, struck by shrapnel when the second torpedo ripped open the signal shack. The executive officer, Lieutenant Colton Rourke, now commanded, but his voice shook. Hard to port. Bring her around. The helmsman spun the wheel. The ship responded sluggishly, as if reluctant to move. From the fire control tower, a gunnery officer shouted, They're behind us now. We've been crossfired. Quincy's searchlight snapped toward the source of incoming shells. For a split second, the beams illuminated an enemy cruiser. Sleek, purposeful, silent except for the thunder of her guns. The Japanese cruiser Aoba fired a full broadside. 8 8-inch guns spat flame. 8 shells screamed across the water. 8 impacts hammered Quincy. Superstructure, radar mast, upper deck. Pieces of the bridge disintegrated. Glass, metal, and flesh rained downward. Jack Hargrove, still at the bow, saw one of the searchlight crews get vaporized. No bodies, just a flash, then nothing. He staggered toward a hose station. Men shouted around him. Magazines on fire. Flooding in forward diesel compartment. Steering is gone, we're losing control. The ship shuddered again. Another torpedo had struck aft. 3 torpedoes. No American ship could survive that. In damage control central, a chief, weary, burned, bleeding from the scalp, grabbed the sound-powered phone. Quincy to all hands. Abandon ship. Abandoned. A thunderous groan cut him off. The ship listed to port, then harder. Seawater rushed across the deck, sweeping men off their feet. Jack sprinted toward the starboard rail, only to slip. Dan Morales, appearing through smoke like a ghost, grabbed him by the collar and yanked him upright. Move, kid. Move, Jack shouted, voice cracking. Why aren't you going? Dan pushed him toward the rail. Because someone has to make sure the rest get out. Another explosion near the forward magazine lifted Dan off his feet and threw him into flame and shadow. Jack vaulted the rail. The ocean swallowed him whole. Floating in the burning sea, salt water filling his mouth, Jack looked back at Quincy. Her stern lifted, bow sinking, flames reflecting off the oily black waves like hell's mirror. Men leapt, some too late. The great cruiser slid beneath the water. Jack treaded the warm, fuel-slick waves, gasping, staring at the spot where Quincy disappeared. The long lance had done what no American sailor believed possible. It had killed a ship from beyond the range of American imagination. August 8, 1942, 04:10, dawn, east of Savo Island. The sea was a graveyard of drifting bodies, splintered rafts, and oil. The scent of burning fuel hung low across the water like a suffocating blanket. Dawn peeled open the horizon in layers, first violet, then a sickly orange, and in the widening light the full horror was revealed. Jack Hargrove clung to a cork life ring, his skin shimmering with oil. His breath came in shallow, ragged pulls. Every wave tasted like gasoline. He forced himself to keep his face above the surface, blinking through the burn of salt and fuel, searching for survivors. A voice carried over the waves, hoarse, gasping. "Help, here." Jack kicked hard, pushing through the slick. A sailor surfaced beside him, coughing violently, blood staining his lips. "Jesus, Frank?" "Frank?" Signalman Frank Daly blinked up at him with one good eye. The other was sealed shut by swollen flesh and oil. "Quincy's gone," Frank rasped. She went fast." Jack swallowed hard. "I know." Frank shivered violently. Wasn't supposed to be like that. Torpedoes don't reach that far." His voice broke. "They lied to us. Jack, our intel lied to us." A distant engine rumble interrupted them. Both men looked up. A small landing craft, LCVP Higgins boat from USS San Diego, skimmed toward them, weaving through debris. Sailors leaned over the rails, hauling survivors aboard. Jack pushed Frank toward the boat. "Come on!" Hands reached down, grabbed their arms, and pulled them into safety. Inside the LCVP, men sat in silence, eyes hollow, bodies shivering uncontrollably. Some were wrapped in blankets. Others stared back at the smoke rising from Savo Island. A bosun's mate worked through survivors, taking names, injuries, units. Name? Hargrove, Jack, USS Quincy. Anyone else from Quincy? Jack shook his head, voice quivering. Most didn't make it. The bosun swallowed and scribbled. Behind them, a cruiser continued to burn. Meanwhile, aboard U.S. Task Force flagship USS Macaulay, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner strode across the plotting room, boots clanging. Officers with clipboards followed like frightened birds. Turner's face was carved into fury, sharp, focused, volcanic. How does an entire screening force get hit before identifying enemy contact? Turner barked. A communications officer thrust a report into his hand. Turner scanned it, jaw tightening. Torpedoes at extreme range. Turner slammed the report to the table. Impossible. Japanese torpedoes don't have that range. An Australian liaison officer in khakis stepped forward. Sir, with respect, they clearly do. The room froze. The officer placed a pair of binoculars on the table, recovered from a lifeboat. He spoke quietly, voice weighed down by exhaustion. We recovered sailors. They said the torpedoes left no wake. Turner's eyes narrowed. Every torpedo leaves a wake. No, sir. The liaison swallowed hard. These were different. The word hung in the air. Different. The intelligence officer, Commander Halstead, approached with a stack of enemy ordnance reports. He lowered his voice. We have unconfirmed pre-war theory. The Japanese may have attempted pure oxygen propulsion. The room snapped to attention. Heads lifted. Pure oxygen? Turner repeated. No nitrogen, Halstead said. No bubbles? No visible trail, the Australian officer added softly. And much longer range. Turner stared at the map, at the arc of estimated Japanese torpedo movement. The line was absurd. 40 kilometers. His voice became a whisper. They outranged us. He recoiled as if struck. All doctrine, night tactics, screening distance, cruiser spacing, assumed torpedoes were limited. Now reality shredded that doctrine in one night. A young ensign stepped closer, tremor in his voice. Admiral, what do we call it? Turner looked at him, haggard, furious, stunned. The long lance. It wasn't admiration. It was acknowledgement of a nightmare. Japanese cruiser Chokai, Mikawa's flagship Rear Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, stood calmly on the open-air bridge. His uniform was immaculate. Not a single wrinkle betrayed. The chaos below deck where torpedo crews stored, empty launch racks, a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, a rare crack in the stoic facade. His operations officer approached. Admiral, message from command. Should we pursue and destroy the American transports at Guadalcanal? Mikawa considered the instruction. No, he finally said. Our mission was to strike the screening force. We have done so, but sir, we will withdraw. Dawn belongs to the Americans. Their aircraft will be on us like hawks. The junior officer bowed his head. Yes, Admiral. Mikawa lit a cigarette, staring across the water at the burning horizon. The long lance had done its job. Back aboard the American rescue craft, Jack Hargrove sat wrapped in a blanket, hands trembling uncontrollably. Frank Daly leaned against him, drifting in and out of consciousness. A courseman moved between them, taping gauze to burns. Jack stared at the sea, saw the last pieces of Quincy slip beneath the waves, saw oil fires dancing in the dawn, he whispered to himself, barely audible. They never missed. They never even missed. He didn't know yet that the U.S. Navy would rewrite every training manual because of this night. He didn't know that the Japanese Type 93 would sink more Allied ships than any surface weapon of the war. All Jack knew was this. Everything they thought they knew about naval combat was wrong. August 10th, 1942. Pearl Harbor Naval Base, Intelligence Analysis Wing. The office smelled of stale coffee, damp paper, and frustration. A fan rotated slowly on the ceiling, doing little against the Honolulu humidity. Commander Frank Halstead, lean, tired, eyes bloodshot from 2 nights without sleep, rolled open a map of the Solomon Islands across a long drafting table. Pinned to the map were strings and markers plotting the U.S. formation, the approximate Japanese approach, and most importantly, the locations where torpedoes struck. Each pin was an accusation. 3 pins on Quincy, 2 on Vincennes, 1 on Astoria, 1 on Canberra, Royal Australian Navy. Halstead rubbed a hand across his jaw. Look at the distances. Lieutenant Eleanor Jacobs, a 24-year-old operations analyst, brilliant, sharp-tongued, leaned over the map. That's 20,000 yards, she whispered. No torpedo travels that far. Halstead tapped the board with the end of a pencil. This one did. He slid a reconnaissance photo across the table, grainy, taken from an observation seaplane after sunrise near Savo Island. In the frame, debris and oil fields drifted across dead flat water. No other clues. No torpedo fragments retrieved. Nobody had seen the weapon. Jacobs frowned. You're proposing a pure oxygen torpedo? I'm not proposing anything, Halstead snapped. I'm telling you what the survivors reported. He picked up a typed transcript, shaky handwriting in the margins. Torpedo wake was faint, almost invisible. Range far beyond our estimates. Hit before we detected destroyers. A senior intelligence officer, Captain Marsden, approached, silver-haired, posture stiff as a mast. You want to tell the Admiralty, Marsden said dryly, that Japan has a weapon we don't believe is technically practical? Halstead held his ground. Yes. Marsden set down his clipboard with a soft clack. We have no recovered samples. No physical proof, Jacobs interjected. Sir, we have geometry. The hit patterns are proof. Marsden cut her off with a raised hand. Admiral King will not tolerate panic. We do not alter doctrine based on survivor testimony. Halstead stepped forward. Eyes narrowed. With respect, sir, if we don't acknowledge this, more ships will die. Marsden leaned close enough, Halstead could smell the overpowering aftershave. Are not rewriting American naval doctrine because one battered cruiser. Captain claimed the Japanese hit him from 15 miles away. Halstead's voice dropped to a cold, lethal whisper. They're not claiming. They're dead. Marsden paused. The room stopped breathing. Finally, Marsden straightened his jacket. The official report will state the Japanese closed to short range under cover of darkness. Jacobs stared at him, incredulous. Sir, that didn't happen. Marsden picked up the file labeled After Action Report, Savo Island, and slid it into a folder marked Classified, Level Red. The Navy does not acknowledge long-range oxygen torpedoes. Just like that, the truth was buried deeper than Quincy. Guadalcanal, Field Hospital, near Henderson Airfield. Jack Hargrove stared at the ceiling canvas of the temporary hospital tent, listening to rain slap against the canvas. His burns were bandaged, but the smell of fuel still clung to his hair, his clothes, his nightmares. Frank Daly lay in the cot beside him, pale, eyes closed. A corpsman adjusted his IV line. Jack whispered, We told them. We told the officers exactly what we saw. The corpsman glanced up. Command will listen. They have to. Jack shook his head. They laughed at us before. They'll probably keep laughing. Footsteps approached, measured, authoritative. Lieutenant Commander Avery, alive, limping, arm in a sling, entered the tent. Jack struggled upright. Sir, you made it, Avery nodded. Barely. Float bag washed me up on a Higgins boat. He pulled up a stool. His voice was quiet. I gave testimony, same as you. And? Avery looked down at the dirt between his boots. They don't believe us. Frank Daly stirred weakly. What do they think hit us? Avery hesitated. They think we misjudged the range. Jack clenched his jaw. We saw the wakes. They were faint, but it doesn't matter, Avery said. They think the Japanese got close. A silence settled over the tent, heavy as grief. Jack finally spoke, voice hollow. They're going to get more men killed. Avery cleared his throat. Orders just came down. We go back to sea in 3 days. Another convoy escort. Jack stared. You're sending survivors of a sunken cruiser back into combat? We don't have replacements, Avery said. We barely have functioning cruisers. He stood slowly. One more thing. He placed a wrapped parcel at the foot of Jack's cot. Jack opened it. Quincy's battle ensign scorched around the edges. Avery's voice cracked. Keep her with you. Not everyone gets a chance to fight again. Tokyo Naval Headquarters, Engineering Division Rear. Admiral Shigeru Tanaka poured tea for 2 visiting naval attachés. Closed doors, lock engaged. A blueprint lay open on the table. Type 93 oxygen torpedo system schematics. You must not speak of this weapon outside secure walls, Tanaka said calmly. One attaché asked, Admiral, do the Americans know? Tanaka allowed a thin smile. They suspect only that we are better at night fighting. And the torpedo? Tanaka placed one hand on the blueprint. They believe such a thing is impossible. He lifted his teacup. 2 impossibilities. Back in the hospital tent, Jack stared at the scorched flag folded in his hands. He whispered, They don't believe us now, but they will. Because out at sea and every dark night to come, somewhere beyond the reach of radar, Japan was already loading another long lance. October 11th, 1942. Night. The slot. Solomon Islands. Wind whipped across the deck of the light cruiser USS Boise as she cut through the channel. Sailors were beginning to call the slot. The moon hid behind clouds. Rain lashed sideways across the bridge windows. The sea was black glass. Boise ran at flank speed alongside USS Salt Lake City, responding to intelligence of a Japanese bombardment. Force heading toward Henderson Field. The brass in Washington still maintained that Japanese torpedoes were of standard range. Admiral Turner's staff continued to cite improper lookout procedures as the cause of the Savo Island disaster. But below decks, sailors whispered a different truth. The Japanese had a torpedo that outranged anything on Earth, and tonight, they were about to meet it again. USS Boise. Radar plot room. The smell of wet wool. Cigarette smoke and hot vacuum tubes filled the cramped compartment. Ensign Harold Dubrin bent over the radar display, squinting as faint green blips crawled across the phosphor screen. Range, 18,000 yards, he murmured. The chief radar operator leaned near. Probably our own destroyers. Dubrin frowned. No, sir. Bearing is wrong. Too tight a formation. He lifted the sound-powered phone. Bridge radar plot, multiple contacts unknown, midnight bearing. Range 18,000, correction, 17,000. He waited for acknowledgement. Silence. Rain hammered the deck overhead. He keyed the phone again. Bridge, this is radar plot. We have a sharp click. Someone had hung up. Boise Bridge, 2342 Captain Edward J. Moran, short, raw-boned, a veteran of 20 years, stood at the starboard wing, gripping cold railing with one hand and a pair of binoculars with the other. His exec, Lieutenant Commander Harris, lowered a headset. Radar plot says unidentified contacts. Moran didn't lower his binoculars. Probably rain distortion. Radar's tricky in weather. Harris's voice went tight. Sir, I recommend altering course. We still have no confirmation. We will not zigzag every time a radar blip looks suspicious. Moran said, doctrine still held sway. Destroyers and cruisers were expected to close to gun range before torpedoes became a threat. Down on the deck, sailors loaded powder charges into 6-inch turrets. Turret hatches slammed like steel coffins. Japanese destroyer Natsugumo, torpedo deck petty officer, Saito, now leading a torpedo team after Savo Island's success, wore a rain cape that clung to his uniform like wet skin. He stood beside the long, sleek cylinders of Type 93 torpedoes, watching water bead on their polished casings. The oxygen feed valves hissed gently. A young sailor at his side whispered, "Are we truly at range, petty officer?" Saito nodded. "The Americans think we must close. We do not." Captain Shoji, calm as still water, raised his voice above the wind. Bearing resolved. Range acceptable. Fire when ready. Saito's hands danced over the valve wheels. dialing in pure compressed oxygen. He whispered to himself, "No bubbles." The torpedo slid into the sea without a splash. Just silence. USS Boise. Main battery control. A fire controlman turned, eyes wide. "Captain." Wake sighted. Starboard bow. Moran stiffened. "Impossible. Japanese torpedoes don't have that kind of—" Then came the sound. Oomp! Not a sharp blast, more a deep, crushing punch. The deck lurched, men fell. Steam lines burst in a white hiss. Boise shuddered like an animal trying to shake off an unseen predator. Boise had been hit below the waterline, flooding on frames 40 to 50. Someone shouted through the battle intercom. Tong CMDR. Harris grabbed the speaking tube. "Damage control teams, seal compartments and counterflood port side." Boise was still afloat, barely. Moran stared into the dark rain. A torpedo. From that distance? "Radar plot," he barked. "What range were those contacts?" The reply was faint, shaky. 17,000 yards, sir." Moran swallowed. 17,000 yards. Over 8 nautical miles. This wasn't bad intel anymore. This was a catastrophe. Gunners, target bearing 355, open fire. Boise's 6-inch guns roared to life. Flame bursting from turrets like lightning trapped in steel. The ship shook with every salvo. Shell tracers streaked across the night sky. But the Japanese were already repositioning, turning for another perfect torpedo spread. Japanese destroyer Natsugumo Saito's spotter called out, "American cruiser firing blind." Shoji removed his binoculars, rain dripping off his cap brim. "Prepare second salvo." Saito grabbed the torpedo trigger handle. Second tube. Ready. Click. The torpedo vanished into the angry Black Sea. USS Boise. Forward magazine compartment steam. Smoke. Screams. A ruptured water main sprayed scalding water across the forward ammunition hoist. Gunner's mate Albert Price slammed the emergency hatch wheel with everything he had. "Seal it. Seal it, it's going to hit the magazine." A second torpedo struck. Boom! The world became white fire. The shockwave hurled Price against a bulkhead. Lights went out. The magazine officer grabbed the emergency flooding lever and screamed, "Drown the magazine." Seawater poured in. Ammunition hissed and crackled as water flooded around it. Above on the bridge, Moran steadied himself as Boise's bow belched flame. Fire control called out, "Forward magazine is flooded, Captain." Moran exhaled. They had avoided a ship-killing detonation by seconds, but Boise was no longer a warship. She was a burning wreck limping away from the fight. Japanese deck. Watching the flames, Saito stood at the rail and watched the American cruiser pull away. Burning from stem to stern, he offered a short bow of respect. They fought well. Shoji nodded. Courage is meaningless without understanding your enemy's weapon. USS Boise. Damage control. Triage Harris knelt beside a sailor whose legs were gone. The young man's breathing was shallow. Morphine dulled everything except the terror in his eyes. Harris squeezed his hand. "We're taking you home," the sailor whispered, barely audible. They said, "Torpedoes couldn't reach." Harris looked away. Shame burned in his chest hotter than the fires. They were wrong. And as damage control fought to save the ship, as casualties lined passageways, as the sea swallowed more wreckage, America finally believed. The Long Lance was real. It was a widowmaker. And Japan ruled the night. October 15, 1942. Noumea Naval Base, New Caledonia. The USS Boise limped into harbor like a ghost ship. Her bow was a mangled, blackened crater. Steel plates curled outward like petals. Crewmen lined the rails, wrapped in blankets, some with bandaged heads or arms in slings, others staring into nothing. Tugboats guided the cruiser into position while stretcher-bearers waited on the pier. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself had flown in from Pearl Harbor the night before. If Boise had sunk, Guadalcanal would have fallen. The gangway clanged against the rail. Captain Moran descended slowly, one hand gripping the railing. His uniform was still streaked with soot. A young staff officer approached with a clipboard. "Sir, SINCPAC requests a damage assessment and contact report within." Moran stopped walking. His voice was low, gravelly. "Give me a minute to bury my dead." The officer swallowed hard and stepped aside. Behind Moran, sailors carried a stretcher draped in canvas. Blood seeped through the cloth. A seabird cried overhead, the only sound in the heavy morning air. Intelligence briefing room. 0830 hours charts covered the wall. Naval attachés, analysts, and operations planners crowded into the cramped room. Coffee cups shook slightly from the vibration of nearby repair hammers pounding Boise's hull. Nimitz opened the briefing with a blunt question. Why can the Japanese hit our ships from beyond radar range? Silence. Captain Moran stood at the head of the table. He had slept maybe 2 hours. He pointed to a chart showing the attack. This wasn't a fluke. The first torpedo hit us at 17,000 yards. The second at roughly 15. A lieutenant from Naval Ordnance raised a hand timidly. Respectfully, sir. Japanese torpedoes have a maximum. Moran cut him off. They hit us. Moran placed a damaged torpedo fragment on the table. The metal gleamed, polished in some places, burned black in others. Look at the oxygen feed lines. Nimitz leaned closer. His face tightened. Pure oxygen. A torpedo engineer stepped forward, voice shaky. Oxygen would burn hotter. Give more thrust. More range. But it's too dangerous, the ordnance lieutenant said, shaking his head. If the oxygen line ruptures or ignites, it explodes, the engineer finished. Moran tapped the torpedo fragment. They're willing to take that risk. Nimitz turned his chair slowly toward the group. Eyes cold, voice steady. Gentlemen, we have underestimated the enemy. He placed a hand on the fragment. This changes everything. Pearl Harbor, Naval Ordnance Facility. 2 weeks later, blueprints of every known Japanese destroyer lay scattered across drafting tables. Photographs of Savo Island and Cape Esperance were pinned to corkboards. A torpedo diving team rotated in shifts, dissecting recovered pieces. An analyst leaned in and whispered to another, "They built something we can't match." Not yet. The senior engineer, Commander Hadley, slammed a grease pencil onto the table. This is no normal torpedo. Look at this exhaust, no wake, no trail. It's practically invisible. A hush fell across the group. Hadley continued, voice low, almost reverent. They call it the Type 93, but the crews have another name. He looked at the young officers. The Long Lance, Washington, D.C. Pentagon classified meeting. War Plans Division Rear Admiral King paced, cigar clamped in his teeth. A map of the Solomons glowed under a desk lamp. The Japanese own the night. Every cruiser we send in gets torn apart. An aide hesitated. Sir, they're using radar better than we expected. King stopped, slowly turned. No, they're using torpedoes better than anyone expected. He pointed at the map with the lit end of his cigar, leaving a small burn mark. The next time we go into those waters, we don't fight them at night. A pause, or we adapt. USS Boise, repair dock, midnight floodlights illuminated the wounded cruiser. Welders sent sparks raining over the dry dock floor. Sparks looked like fireflies dancing around a ship that should have been at the bottom of the sea. Below the hull, a group of sailors smoked in silence. One finally exhaled and said, "Think they'll change tactics now?" Another shrugged. They'd better, or we're next. Above them, on a catwalk overlooking the ship, Captain Moran watched the welding crews. He held a scrap of torpedo metal in his hand, the same one he had placed on Nimitz's table. He whispered to himself, "No more underestimating." He tightened his grip. No more ignoring facts. A gust of wind blew sparks across the deck. We learn from this, or we die from it. Fade to black. January 1943, Espiritu Santo, New Hebrides night training. No moon. A black sea stretched out like a sheet of cold iron. Destroyer USS Fletcher, DD 445, knifed through the water. Her bridge lights were killed, engines throttled back. Every man aboard felt the pressure, because tonight wasn't routine practice. It was a rehearsal for survival. Commander William A. Bill Hughes, Fletcher's captain, stood on the bridge wing with binoculars. Spray dampened his face. The air reeked of diesel and salt. His exec, Lieutenant Commander Rowe, leaned over a chartboard lit only by a red lamp. "You know what they're calling this exercise, XO?" Hughes asked, voice low. Rowe nodded. "Anti-long lance maneuvers. A month earlier, that phrase didn't exist. Now men whispered it like a superstition." Hughes lowered his binoculars and stared into the black horizon. Radar contact. 2 ships, maybe more. He wasn't thinking about ships. He was thinking about torpedoes. 8 miles away, invisible and silent, a Type 93 long lance could already be slicing toward him, and there'd be no wake. No warning until men were screaming and steel was tearing. "Helm," he said quietly. "Begin zigzag pattern. Assume long lance range and bearing." "Aye, aye, sir." The ship began shifting like a wary animal sniffing danger. Rowe glanced over. "You really think they're that far-reaching?" Hughes stared into the darkness. "They hit Boise at 17,000 yards. I believe anything now. Combat Information Center, USS Fletcher." This was the new heartbeat of the ship, a cramped room packed with radar scopes, grease pencils, and voice tubes running like nervous veins through the steel walls. A radar operator, Seaman First Class Johnny Harris, leaned close to his display. Contacts holding steady. Bearing 040, he hesitated. "Sir, if they're Japanese destroyers, we're in torpedo range." Lieutenant J.G. Marcus Doyle, the CIC officer, placed a steady hand on Harris's shoulder. "Then we don't give them a clean shot." Doyle began marking predicted torpedo cones on a transparent plotting board. "Captain wants flank speed. Let's make ourselves harder to hit." He grabbed the sound-powered phone. "Bridge, CIC, recommend sharp turn to port. Angle away from predicted torpedo fan." "Bridge, USS Fletcher." The ship leaned into the turn, bulkheads groaning. Spray exploded over the bow as Fletcher charged into a new bearing. Hughes gripped the railing, feeling the deck vibrate with power. No cruiser commander before Savo Island would have done this. Doctrine used to say, "Close range, fire guns, finish fast." But Doctrine didn't live in the water with the long lance. Hughes looked aft, watching the phosphorescent glow churned by Fletcher's props. "XO," he said. "Get the torpedo crews ready. If they're going to fire, so will we." Rowe nodded, snapped open the bridge phone. "All hands, torpedo crews to stations." Metal hatch covers slammed open along Fletcher's side. Torpedo handlers sprinted across deck, boots thundering. Chief Torpedo Man Jack Miller yanked the canvas cover off a Mark 15 torpedo, America's equivalent to the Long Lance. Except the Mark 15 wasn't the Long Lance. It left a wake. It had less range. And sometimes, it didn't even explode. But tonight, Fletcher wasn't waiting to react to a torpedo. She was here to fire first. Elsewhere, Japanese destroyer Kawakaze Rain misted over the torpedo deck. Petty Officer Saito, now seasoned by multiple engagements, walked the firing line. 6 Type 93 torpedoes gleamed under dim deck lights. A spotter lifted binoculars. American destroyer. Heading into the channel, Saito nodded. They will close to gun range. They always do. He reached toward the main oxygen valve. Then he froze. The American ship was changing course. Constantly, erratically. He frowned. "They're zigzagging before contact?" The spotter looked confused. "Why would they?" Saito's eyes narrowed. "They're anticipating torpedoes." Back on Fletcher, Combat Information Center. The radar operator suddenly stiffened. "Sir, enemy destroyer has turned broadside." Doyle spun toward the captain's phone. "They're lining up for a torpedo spread." Bridge, USS Fletcher. Hughes didn't hesitate. "Turn away, hard to starboard." Fletcher heeled over sharply, deck tilting. Men grabbed rails. Waves smashed the hull, and then, whom a torpedo streaked through Fletcher's wake. Just 10 seconds earlier, it would have cut the ship in half. Hughes exhaled. "They missed." Rowe stared in disbelief. "Sir, we just dodged a long lance." Hughes looked down toward Torpedo Mount 1, then to his helmsman. "Let's return the favor." Torpedo deck, USS Fletcher. Chief Miller. "Grip the firing trigger. Solution ready." Hughes's voice boomed over the bridge annunciator. "Torpedo fire!" Miller yanked the trigger. The deck-mounted tube recoiled with a metallic shudder. A white streak marked Fletcher's torpedo slicing through the black water, heading straight toward Kawakaze. Seconds stretched. Then, a bloom of orange fire erupted on the horizon. The Japanese destroyer lurched, flame ripping from its midsection. Cheers exploded across Fletcher's deck. For the first time in the Pacific War, an American destroyer had outmaneuvered the Long Lance. Rowe stared out at the dying glow. "We finally figured it out," he whispered. Hughes shook his head. "We figured out one night." He looked toward the horizon, the endless dark where long lances still lurked. "War isn't over, but we're learning." October 25, 1944, Surigao Strait, Philippines, midnight. The sea was a sheet of black steel, broken only by flashes of distant lightning. The monstrous shapes of U.S. battleships, USS West Virginia, USS California, USS Tennessee, and others, waited silently, guns angled toward the narrow throat of the strait. Their long silhouettes formed the last battleship battle line the world would ever see. Beyond the darkness, a battered Japanese task force crept forward. Yamashiro, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and destroyers acting as escorts. Japan was desperate, outnumbered, and cornered. Their plan, part of the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf, was reckless. Punch through Surigao Strait. Hit the U.S. landing forces, die if necessary. And there, among the small escorting destroyers, were the last masters of the Type 93 Long Lance Petty Officer Saito. Older, thinner, his eyes burdened, stood again on a torpedo deck. But this time the destroyer wasn't fresh or confident. Its paint was scorched. Its rails were bent. Its crew was gaunt. The flagship destroyer Shiger led the torpedo group. Saito wiped rain from his eyes and checked the oxygen feed valves. The Long Lances lay ready, their paint chipped. Their casings pitted but still lethal. He murmured, "One more time." Behind him, Lieutenant Commander Fujita, the destroyer's torpedo officer, approached and read the ocean with tired eyes. "We won't come back from this," Fujita said quietly. Saito nodded. He knew. No ships returned from missions like this anymore. Japan was burning out. Aboard USS West Virginia, Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf stood on his bridge, a mug of black coffee warming his hands. He watched radar operators track the Japanese advance. In his ear, the CIC fed him a steady stream of updates. "Admiral, destroyer flotilla reports torpedoes likely inbound within minutes." Oldendorf smirked grimly. "Let them come. We're not the same Navy we were in 42. His battle line, the very concept of naval power pre-war, was now supported by destroyers and PT boats employing lessons bought with blood. No closing to torpedo range, no straight-line approaches. Radar control first, gunnery second. Oldendorf turned toward his operations officer. "We'll cross their T." It was the holy grail of naval tactics, presenting all your guns while the enemy could only fire forward. The officer nodded. Just like Nelson. Oldendorf didn't look away from the strait, just like Boise should have done. Surigao Strait, Japanese destroyer Shigure Rain hammered the deck. The ship throttled forward, engines groaning. Saito watched the silhouettes of giant American battleships appear like black mountains on the horizon. The Type 93 torpedo officer barked orders. "All tubes, stand by." Sailors moved quickly. Disciplined movements despite exhaustion. Saito's hands trembled only slightly as he adjusted the pure oxygen feed lines. Fujita looked at the officers around him. "This is our final gift to the Emperor." No one spoke. They all understood. Their torpedoes could cripple battleships, maybe even break the American line. They might die, but if the Long Lances landed, history might remember them. Saito gripped the firing lever. He whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for meaning. Aboard USPT boats, entrance to Surigao Strait Lieutenant Raymond Phillips, commander of PT-137, squinted through binoculars. He could barely see anything through the rain, but radar didn't care. "You smell that?" he muttered. His radio man sniffed. "Diesel fumes?" "No, opportunity." The PT boats had a simple mission: get in close, fire torpedoes, get out. They were gnats in a world of giants. Then a sudden voice in the headset. "All PT boats. Enemy destroyers launching torpedoes." Phillips stiffened, Long Lances. "Helm, hard to port." The PT boat swerved sharply, spray engulfing the bow. Behind him, PT-131 wasn't as lucky. A torpedo streaked past its stern, white water erupting in a vicious plume. Phillips exhaled hard. "Close one. Those weren't our kind of fish." Aboard USS West Virginia, multiple torpedoes detected crossing our track. Oldendorf nodded to his helmsman. "Initiate counter-torpedo turn." The battleship leaned, not gracefully but with massive power, as the stern swung away from predicted torpedo lines. Around him, men worked silently, professionally. Unlike the confusion of Savo Island, everything here was controlled. Enemy torpedoes passing astern. Radar reported. Oldendorf's voice was calm. They missed. Open fire. Stored fury awakened. The night exploded. West Virginia's 16-inch guns lit the sky with orange lightning. California, Maryland, Tennessee, the entire line, unleashed a storm of steel. The gun blasts were so powerful the sea surface flattened beneath them. At 03:53, the first salvo slammed into the battleship Yamashiro. The second salvo broke her back. Mogami took shells that turned her decks into molten craters. Shigeru miraculously slipped through untouched. But Saito watched the others die. One destroyer detonated as its own torpedoes cooked off, a fireball rising like a dying sun. Saito grabbed the railing and screamed a hoarse order. Fire everything. The long lances leapt into the sea, more than a dozen of them vanishing into the abyss. Minutes later, flashes lit the water behind the American lines. Massive plumes erupted, some hits on PT boats, near misses on cruisers, but none struck the battleships. The long lance had fired its last great salvo, but it could not change the outcome. Yamashiro rolled to her side, her keel exposed like a dying whale. Fires raged across the ocean as hundreds of men struggled in burning water. Saito watched silently. Rain masked the tears running down his face. "This is the end," he whispered. Fujita placed a hand on his shoulder. "No weapon lasts forever." Shigeru turned and ran through the rain squalls, leaving behind the wrecks of her sisters. The legend of the long lance ended not with a triumph, but with a lesson. 1945, Tokyo Bay. The war was over. Aboard the USS Missouri, the surrender documents were signed. Cameras flashed. Flags rippled. The Japanese delegation stood silent and rigid as the Allied officers looked on, uniforms crisp, medals gleaming. Among the surrender observers was a small group of U.S. Navy intelligence officers, men who had lost friends to a weapon the rest of the world once believed impossible. One of them, Commander Hadley, held a clipboard. On it were documents related to the Type 93 torpedo. The lines were technical: oxygen feed, compressed gas staging, stabilizer fins, but all he saw were ghosts. When the ceremony ended, he turned to a junior officer beside him. "We spent years laughing at the Japanese torpedo," he said quietly. "They spent years perfecting it. Post-war naval arsenal, Yokosuka, Japan." 2 weeks later, torch sparks lit the shadows of the dismantling yard. American engineers walked along rows of captured Type 93 torpedoes. Their surfaces were pitted, scarred from battle, but inside they were a revelation. Pure compressed oxygen lines. Massive warheads, 180 pounds of explosive. Unmatched range, over 40 kilometers. Even now, no Allied torpedo came close. Commander Hadley rested his hand on one. This thing changed naval warfare. Beside him, a young ordnance officer flipped through his notebook. "Sir, why did we never consider pure oxygen propulsion?" "It seems obvious." Hadley shook his head. "Too unstable, too risky, too unconventional." He paused, then spoke the uncomfortable truth. "And because we assumed the enemy couldn't think of it." A Japanese torpedo engineer, sitting across a table at a debriefing, an elderly Japanese torpedo engineer, formerly of the Kaiten Torpedo Bureau, sat rigidly with hands folded. A translator waited for the first question. His face was unreadable, neither proud nor apologetic. Commander Hadley leaned forward. "Why oxygen? Why push your men to handle such a dangerous weapon?" The engineer spoke softly, voice rasped with age. "To win the war, we knew we could not afford to lose." Hadley frowned. "You mean range?" "No." The engineer finally looked up. His eyes were calm. "We wanted to fight a larger enemy with fear." He tapped the table gently. "When your sailors realized no distance was safe, fear became our ally." Pearl Harbor, Naval War College, 1947. Seminar room. Young officers sat at desks, notebooks open. On the projector screen, photos of USS Boise, USS Quincy, HMS Canberra, and others, ships lost or damaged in the early Pacific nights. A senior lecturer pointed to the silhouette of a Type 93 torpedo. "Gentlemen, remember this. The most dangerous weapon is not the one you see." He clicked the next slide. "It's the one you dismiss." A murmur rippled across the room. He circled the torpedo in red. "This is what happens when arrogance writes doctrine." USS Boise, reunion ceremony, 1962. Jacksonville Naval Memorial Park. Old sailors stood beneath the towering steel hull of the Boise, lovingly restored and mounted in honor. Their hair was gray, their movement slow, but their eyes still carried the memory of fire and seawater. Captain Moran, retired now, leaning on a cane, spoke into a microphone. We mocked the Japanese torpedo. He steadied. Himself. We assumed they would never build something better. He placed a hand on the memorial plaque. We were wrong. A moment of silence followed. Finally, Moran looked out at the crowd, at the young sailors standing at attention, and left them with the words carved into the plaque below. Respect your enemy or learn from your mistake. Final montage. Narration over visuals. A Type 93 torpedo is lowered into a museum cradle. Blueprints are rolled into archival storage. Veterans walk away slowly, their service caps tucked under one arm. Voiceover. The Long Lance torpedo didn't win the war for Japan, but it changed how wars at sea would be fought forever. Range is power. Silence is fear, and underestimation is fatal. Fade to black.